again to the conference. I'm Camilo Tamayo Gomez. As you know, a senior lecturer at the University of Huddersfield, and I'm going to chair the first session of our conference that is entitled Workers, Farmers, and Retirees During the Pandemic. We have three really interesting presentations. I'm going to give 15 minutes to each presenter to, of course, explain and present the paper. And after that, we'll have a QI session for, let's say, 10-15 minutes. So our first presenter is Avishnek Dividu from South Asian University. And Avishnek, the floor is yours. And sorry, and the next presenter, Rajesh and Natalia, will come after. So please, Avishnek, the floor is yours, 15 minutes.
Thank you so much, sir. Is my screen visible?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present my doctoral research in this conference. The title of my paper is Casual Workers, Resilience and Everyday Modes of Negotiations, a study of leather industry in the pandemic era. To put a brief context of this study, like the informalization of the work of the labor force is now a very accepted trend in the industrial market, and specifically in the manufacturing sector. And given the Indian statistics, it is like around the 94% of our GDP comes into the informal sector, and 82.2% of the workforce is in the unorganized sector. So the share of contract worker in the organized manufacturing has increased from 15.6% from 1990 to 34.7% in 2011 and 12. So this rampant casualization leads to precarious work condition among the workers, and it leads to three kind of insecurities among the worker: the insecurity of tenure, the insecurity of wages, and the insecurity of environment, which Calvert calls the precarious work conditions. However, the state is equally responsible in reinforcing this kind of precarity to make the market more competitive, to make the exports more competitive. Hence, what state is doing is more often than not is favoring the industries whenever the labor disputes comes in, especially in the large corporations where the strong union is present. So thus, the precarity is moreover an integral component of the state growth policies, which may, and thus state and the market forces are.
So Abhishek, I think you unmode yourself.
I didn't unmute myself.
Yeah, cool.
Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
We can.
So
here we can. Yes, fine.
okay.
Cool.
Okay, so the title of my paper is Casual Workers, Resilience and Everyday Modes of Negotiations, a study of leather industry in the pandemic era. To put a brief context of the study, the casualization of labor force is a rampant phenomena in the global economy, and state and market are basically hand in glove with each other to make the exports more competitive. To put this in an Indian perspective, the Indian economy is 94% of Indian GDP falls into the unorganized sector, and 82.2% of the workforce works in this workforce falls into the unorganized sector or the informal workers. And share has grown rapidly from 15.6% in 1990 to 34.7% in the manufacturing sector per se. So thus, this kind of casualization leads to precarious work conditions where the workers face with three kinds of insecurities. First, insecurity of tenure, insecurity of wages, and insecurity of environment. which Calvert calls like falls into the precarious work conditions. Thus, the state is also helping in perpetuating this informalization because it makes exports more competitive and then helps in growing the economy more and more. So whenever the labor dispute comes in, more often than not, state favors the corporations just to make them float in the market. So thus precarity is moreover an integral component of the state growth policies, especially in the developing countries. So because cheap labor is something like the developing countries can offer, which the developed countries, due to strict labor regulations, cannot. So thus, in the case, to put my field site in a perspective, leather industry is facing from quite some time the environment regulations and the closure before the pandemic as well. Pandemic hit in 2020. Sorry, when the pandemic hit before that 2019, because of the strict environment regulations that the state government has imposed, and the beef ban that the right-wing government has imposed. Because of that, the leather industry has suffered massively. And after that, when the industry has recovered for some time, then pandemic hit after some time. So the industry was already in a shambles. So it adversely affected the supply chain management. It reduced the orders and exports, and the closure due to pandemic led to retrenchment of for like 4 months in the first phase, and then 2 months in this when the second wave hit. So thus it affected labor massively. Like vulnerable workers, it led to it increased their vulnerability because they were already casual workers with no or minimum social security. They have to leave the jobs, and there are newspaper reports where thousands and thousands of workers were returning to their hometowns, returning to their villages on foot, and they some in some instances they have covered 1,000 kilometers on foot because the cities are no longer providing them their the employment. So how it affected reverse migration, as I explained, has deeply affected the industry. Now there is a distinction between the the skills of the worker, the skilled worker and unskilled worker. In my field work, I have observed that factory owners have paid incentives and out of the way help the skilled workers because they are much um, skilled workers, skilled craftsmen, because they are if they lose those skilled workers or they join some other factories, then the factories will lose their advantage. So they somehow or other try to hook on to these skilled workers by paying them incentives and some other uh, benefits, while the unskilled workers were totally let go. This practice of udhar advances were devised to keep these workers, though they were not on the payroll, but these like informal measures were adopted to keep them hooked with the industry, attached with the industry. The second wave of COVID-19 was economically less catastrophic for the workers in Kanpur because we have learned the lesson from the first wave where the lockdown was very strict and no relief measures was given to industries. However, in the second wave, which was much catastrophic than the first wave, but due to the economy, the government has not posed very strict measures on the movement. So, but however, in the second wave, the government has learned its lessons and it has provided with multiple welfare measures to the depressed classes. So the basic question that I'm asking is how pandemic affected the precarious work condition among the casual workers in Kanpur. It is I have done the conduct the fieldwork in two phases. First is before pandemic, which we conducted up for the 8 months, and then the second is after the second wave. It was conducted in May and July 2021. This is the field site, and these are some of the stills of the leather industry. My study is basically located in basically concerned with the casual workers who are employed in this factory setup. This is the organizational structure of the leather industry, and in my interviews, you know, uh, I have interviewed casual workers, independent contractors, and contractors who are not on the payroll of the industry. So there are multiple kind of bargaining that I have noticed on the shop floor. And during my, I think, field work of 13 months, on and off on the field. I have only noticed that only once the collective bargaining was adopted by the workers, and it was when the workers, not only workers but the factory owners were also suffering because of the imposition of environment regulations by the state government. So it is before pandemic, and state government has imposed strict measures on the on the factories because non-compliance on the uh, environment regulations, and then for continuous period of 3 or 4 months, and then it went on indefinitely for next 6 months. uh, the factories were closed, so they basically blocked the road uh, in the month of March. And then after some negotiations, the factory the regulations were eased, and some of the factories were allowed to operate on the 50% capacity. However, in the shop floor, before and after pandemic, I have seen a similarity in the contestation what these casual workers adopt. So in the case of Baburam, he met with the accident at the shop floor, and then he broke his leg, and uh, and as the practice goes, he was given a minimum compensation, and not compensation. He was given the cost of treatment, and then he was let go because he was no use of the factory at that time. Then he contacted his local caste members, and the local leadership of that particular caste organization has helped him in negotiating with the local politician, negotiating along with no local politician, and then they got him compensation of 20,000 rupees. Because apart from there is no other source for him uh, to get that compensation if not for these caste leaders or the local politicians. Legal route is very clumsy because one, the worker does not have much capacity, doesn't know labor laws. He can't prove, he doesn't have any proof to. So because the labor regulation says that one must be on the master role if you want to adopt a legal route. He has to prove that he has worked in the minimum 240 days in the shop floor, and no register was maintained, and such practices was adopted so that to wipe out the identity or the presence of workers in the shop floor. Thus, labor lawyers sometimes uh, take their cases on a compensation basis and ask them that that whatever the compensation we will grant you, we will take a certain percentage of that compensation amount, and then instead of fighting these court cases in the legal in the through the legal route, they try to come with a compromise. So legal route is also a way to get a settlement out of the court, which happened in the case of the Imran. um, Chaos is another route that I have observed in the shop floor, that in one incident 13 casual workers who were demanding their pay rise were sacked. Then the internal dynamics has also came up because there are migrant workers and local workers as well. Migrant workers then backed off from the protest, and then the local workers, they were sacked immediately. They approached the police, and police says that uh, the factory owner has not done anything wrong, so we cannot help you. um, and he hinted him like passively that unless and until something wrong happens, we cannot go to shop floor, we cannot go to factory. They understood the hint, and then they created chaos. So when factory owners called the police, then police says that police again, he staged he the police officer, he persuaded the factory owners to take these workers back, and uh, he and then the situation come through a settlement, and though they could not get their pay rise, but they got their job back. Defiance is the most common phenomena that I have observed in the shop floor. Uh, it most commonly it comes when the use of the language. Though the factory, the casual workers doesn't have any kind of security, but what they do not uh, what they most care about is the prestige and the respect in the shop floor. So in the instance, in a multiple instance that I observed that the use of foul language is not tolerated. So in the slums case, supervisor has used the foul language multiple times. He protested initially, and then he slapped him, which is like a very extreme reaction, and he basically broke the hierarchy. And after that, he was sacked. But again, the local politician, the local politics came into the picture, and through the networks and the connections, he got his job back with a fair warning. So thus, pandemic has created a temporary rupture in the flow of the industry. The industry, these are the practices that the worker has told me that they were adopting from the uh, from, before pandemic also and after pandemic also.
Hi, Abhishek, are you with us? Okay. Can people hear me? Or is or was my
Yeah.
computer? Ah, yeah.
Yes, yes,
As I
yes.
was.
Yes.
we hear you.
Okay. Thank you. I was thinking like I was maybe just getting crazy now in this virtual environment. Okay. I think Abhishek has some problems, but he was just finishing. So I guess he will rejoin us. But it was really interesting, this first approach, making this link between precarity, work, and of course the consequences and the impact of the pandemic. So we will explore this later. I'm going just to move with Rajesh from the University, sorry, of Lucknow, and he's going to analyze the farmers' movement in India, if I'm right. So, Rajesh, thank you for being
Yes.
with us this
Thank
morning.
you for.
And you have 15 minutes, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm audible. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Thank you very much. It is not really the farmer movement, but the farmer movement vis-a-vis a rising authoritarian state. So, my uh, um, uh, my point of departure would be the argument given by Geoffrey, the idea that pandemic is a battlefield, in fact, unfolded in India substantively. Right from the beginning of this pandemic. But my argument is, even before the pandemic, it, it has been a battlefield in India. Just before the pandemic, there was a pan-Indian kind of a movement against the Citizenship Act, some enactment in citizenship in India, mainly by minorities, mainly by Muslims. So the movement began in the month of 2019 December and ended when the lockdown was implemented. So the idea is that there is always a situation where state on the one hand and the people on the other, they are always in some kind of struggle with each other, particularly the rising authoritarian state. So I've divided my presentation into three parts. Firstly, I would like to discuss that there is some kind of inversion of democracy in India for last 80 years. India has never been a full kind of democracy, always an electoral democracy. But we have seen that this electoral democracy is being transformed into electoral autocracy. And recently, 2021 and 2022, independent and neutral international observers found out that India has gone down in the ranking of democracy index by the economist group from 23 to 52, by some freedom in the world report, it has gone down from 66 to 77. And recently, by an organization called VDEM, Institute at Sweden, has ranked India, has considered India as one of the 10th most autocrators in the world. So they have labeled India as electoral autocracy rather than a democracy. So the point is that not only these independent international observers, but also some Indian intellectuals like retired judges of Supreme Court, civil servants, and acclaimed senior journalists, they've also considered that India has declining on democracy index, and very fast. Not only this, but we can observe the rise of authoritarianism in everyday social life, political acts, and economic decisions by the state. And not only this, but the principle of separation of power is also crumbling. Now, it is difficult to distinguish between the executive, the parliament, the legislature, and the judiciary. So this is happening in India, and this has been observed and documented. So at the moment, I'm not giving those documents because it's only 15 minutes, but it has been documented. Parliament is also on decline path, and rather it has become an instrument to amend constitution and to pass laws detrimental to people at large. And this has happened in two cases I have cited. One, when Muslims, minorities, they opposed enactment of new citizenship laws, which non-resident citizenship laws. And not only this, the recently farmers also, they came on the roads to oppose enactments. Because Parliament in Parliament, there is hardly any debate and discussion on any new laws or new acts, or rather, even people are not involved when laws regarding them are being made. So gradually this is happening. Nowadays, there is another, for last 8 years particularly, there is an organized and planned effort to stifle minorities and other weaker sections of society by controlling each and every aspect of their life, ranging from eating, dressing, normal relationships, living and their living. Not only by threat of the state violence, by also the threat of organized mob violence. So that is what's happening in India, and policing of every kind of dissent is there in India. So I can argue that in India, the dynamics of authoritarianism is from an authoritarian state to a totalitarian state. I underline the totalitarian state is controlling each and every aspect of social, cultural, economic, and political life. This is, in fact, in collusion with, in collaboration with corporate capitalism, and we can find out this in various economic policy decisions recently, and also we find that this collusion between corporates on the one hand and governing political class on the other hand can be found out in various facts, things. I would argue that there is a kind of oligarchical capitalism in India. There is a rise of, or there is a just growth of oligarchic capitalism in India. So the point corporates now begin to have control over all resources, wealth, economy, with the support of government or political class. That can be found out. And I can give some data, but to provide only a brief data that there is an increase of income of corporates by 41%. This is the government data uh, during this pandemic, and a significant decline of income of common men, common people. 90% of the common people, they live, if I talk in terms of sterling or dollar, $300 a month. 90% of Indian people they live at this juncture, and this is the data given by many agencies. It's not our data. Situation is, the point is that this was sensed by farmers. Farm X were considered by farmers as instances of this hobnobbing and this kind of economic development, and they could sense it, and therefore they were explicit in. They were, you will find them. They were explicit in identifying this cronyism in their main argument against these acts which the Indian Parliament introduced. So I would argue that cronyism can be found at every level of political economy, and this is an open secret, and common people, they can find it out. They find it. So now, as far as this farmers movement goes, I would like to analyze main points of this farmers movement, and then the contradiction between the farmers movement and the rise of this authoritarianism. As you know, that the pandemic began in the March 2020. And on the 4th June of 2020, Indian government proposed an ordinance about 3 farm acts. And they passed this ordinance, and this was implemented immediately. Farmers of northern part of India, northwestern part of India, they became unrest, and they started some kind of localized protest. In the month of June itself, in the last week of June 2020 itself, we found out that there were some acts of protest at the local level, at the village level, or at the taluka level, what we call a district level, sub-district level, sub-county level, we can argue. That started happening. In the month of June 2020, when there was lockdown, the first lockdown was there. By the month of August, when these laws were implemented, farmers were on the street, particularly in the northern province of Punjab. We found that 9th August is a good day for India. Quit India movement started in 1942 against British imperialism. So on 9th August, they started this movement. And thereafter, in the month of September, that movement expanded to other provinces. And they started a stop train and roads movement during that time. And you know that on 27th November, they seized Delhi, because they gave a call to go to Delhi, and they seized Delhi. And seize Delhi means all roads reaching Delhi, all borders reaching Delhi, they encircled Delhi, because government did not allow them to come inside Delhi. And they camped there. They started making camps. Mind it, they did not stop road transport. Only they camped by the side of road. They started camping, and they made makeshift arrangements of all kinds for food, for each and every facility. And they argued that they are going to live in that Delhi borders for a longer period of time, maybe years, if their demands are not met. So that movement is started. You know that the demands were mainly withdrawal of the laws and withdrawal of some other ordinances. And there was an issue of minimum support price in India. They demanded that minimum support price must be legalized. And they also later on added, they added their demands that those leaders of peasants who are arrested, they should be freed. Now, mind it. Now, my argument that in this movement, two main organizations took part. One was called, the organization called Joint Farmers Associations, unions. So it was a 32 unions. They joined together, they came together, and they make a unitary kind of association. And there was another coordination committee of farmers struggle, which included 250 All India farmers organization. So it was very broad based. Oftenly it is argued that it was not centered. It was not true. It's broad based. So the movement, and it included many kinds of farmers, ranging from small peasants, petty farmers, to big farmers. They became united. It was, in fact, against the argument what Marx gave in the 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, or other authors gave, that farmers as a class cannot unite. They united as a class. So it was a class mobilization. Not only it was a class mobilization, but also is a broad-based mobilization. Though activities centered around Delhi, but it was a broad-based mobilization, and included pan-Indian farmers organizations. Now, one argument is that the strategies of movement were very unique. As argued by Geoffrey, solidarity became very important. In order to increase solidarity, the strategies were mainly traditional and social. They incorporated all kinds of traditional communitarian strategies, what is called as langar, or communities, caste community organizations, what in India called their kin organization, their community organization, their caste organization. They came together, and they were used to move for their mobilization strategies. So authoritarian state vis-a-vis a democratic ethos among farmers played an important role in the sustenance of this movement for a longer period of time. Now, my point is, now I can come to a conclusion, because there is little time. My argument is that authoritarianism resisted by this movement through people's strategies, through solidarities, giving solidarities you operated through traditional communitarian strategies. So I can observe four main contradictions, and that is where I finish. That this movement suggests that there is some kind of contradiction between democratic people on the one hand and the authoritarian state on the other. We can find that there is a plural societal tendencies on the one hand and singularizing polity on the other. We can also find that federalism on the one hand and unitarianism on the other, and increasing wealth on the one hand and declining income on the other, these are the main contradictions through which we can analyze the dynamics of authoritarianism in India and resistance against this authoritarianism by a social movement. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Rajesh, and thank you for bringing this new layer now regarding the challenges. And you are highlighting about, of course, authoritarianism and the challenge in democracy. So it's really nice to see the previous two interventions addressing, of course, the case of India, how these challenges on work, how these challenges on democracy, and how categories like precarity and authoritarianism start become like a central for, of course, our work as a social movement scholars. I'm going to bring now the floor to Natalia Miranda, and I know that she's going to take us to another part of the planet. This is in South America, so going from move from India to Chile. So Natalia, you have 50 minutes to do your presentation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Camilo. First of all, do you see my presentation?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Can
Is
see
it moving? Okay.
Thank you.
Great. So thank you, Camilo, once again. I'm really glad to present my work here at this conference. So I will quickly introduce my presentation. In this presentation, I will discuss some tensions and challenges for social movements in defining the meanings of the pandemic crisis, which are settled between collective approaches and usual neoliberal answers. And for this purpose, I will use the Chilean case, which I think is very interesting because it blends both the pandemic crisis with the ongoing process of political and social transformation that the country is currently facing. So I will talk about both situations to make a connection in terms of the interpretation of social movements. Let's begin with the pandemic. A little bit of context. So during the first half of 2020, the world experienced, as you know, a pandemic crisis with cross-cutting effects. For example, uncertainty and economic recession, labor layoffs, and restrictions on mobility. Of course, this is accompanied by an increasing contagion and mortality rates as a result of COVID. This, of course, is a cross-cutting scenario that, in general terms, has affected all countries. And for the Chilean case, the arrival of the pandemic in March 2020 was intermingled with the so-called social outburst, which began in October 2019. So what was or what is this social outburst about? Let's talk a little bit about it. In short, it was a series of protests throughout the country, started by high school students who made a call on social networks such as Instagram to jump the turnstile. That is to evade the payment, as you see in the picture. That is to evade the payment of the metro ticket in Santiago, the capital city of the country. This call for fare evasion was a product of the increase of the ticket by 30 pesos, or about $0.032. So this student protest quickly escalated into a widespread mobilization across the country, whose explosion occurs on October 18 of 2019, mixing peaceful protests, public transport shutdown, street clashes, looting, and a wave of police violence toward protesters, especially shooting in the eyes of the demonstrators, as you can see in the picture. So although it's been said that these mobilizations have had an inorganic leadership where there were no visible leaders or organizations representing the demonstrators, the claims of the mobilization were quickly revealed. For instance, the high cost of living, the over-indebtedness of Chileans, and the high levels of socioeconomic inequality. This was connected as well to a large critique against the lack of social security in the country. So, considering the minimum participation of the state in providing social rights and the enormous expansion of the market in the provision of social welfare, the interpretation of this social outburst was an exhaustion of the neoliberal model, not of capitalism, but of its most savage and uncontrolled version, that is to say, neoliberalism. In fact, the slogan of the revolt was, "It's not 30 pesos, it's 30 years," clearly alluding to the economic legacy left by Pinochet's dictatorship after the return to democracy in the early 90s. All this despite the positive macroeconomic index of the country. But how is this connected to the pandemic? Let's see. So, well, during this wave of protests, COVID arrived in the country, of course, and the pandemic had a demobilizing effect on those who continue to protest, especially as a result of restrictions on mobility and assembly in public spaces, social distancing measures, and quarantines. And of course, this not only translated into consequences for the social movements and the actors that led this social revolt, the mobility restrictions themselves also had consequences for all citizens of the country. For instance, the stoppage of productive activities, the closure and bankruptcy of companies, job losses, and the increase in unemployment meant that many Chileans had to resort to indebtedness to face these moments of economic uncertainty. So if we move towards a more global perspective, social movements throughout the world have stressed the key role of the state as a provider of economic support for its people, particularly for dealing with the pandemic. But this is not the case for everyone, particularly in the global south, and Chile is a good example of this situation. To face this economic uncertainty, the Chilean state has allowed people to use their personal retirement savings to pay for the economic losses due to the pandemic, portraying a strong neoliberal tradition to face social problems. But wait, how is this possible? The key question. As I was saying in the beginning, Chile has been developing a strong neoliberal model in terms of expanding the market as the main provider of social services, such as education, healthcare, unemployment benefits, and of course, retirement pensions. Even though the government has used the concept of social security to encompass these services, they mostly rely on individual citizens' efforts and not a collective or public plan for facing these problems. So let me explain the case of pension savings to understand this particular situation. So the Chilean pension model relies on individual capitalization, that's the word. So each worker has to put 10% of their monthly income into one of the several pension fund administrators. These are private companies that gather workers' money. They invest it in the stock market to make it grow, also charging a fee for this service. Sometimes they win money, sometimes they lose money. This is also the case for pension savings. Sometimes workers obtain profits, but sometimes, most of the time I would say, they lose their savings. So this means that each worker is portrayed as an investor who is responsible for their own retirement funds, and at the same time, these pension fund administrators have increased their net worth exponentially, as seen on the data on the slide. And on the other hand, workers obtain on average very small pensions. In fact, around 80% of retirees obtain pensions below minimum wage. So in short, retirement means a road to poverty. Of course, this shows the lack of social security services in the country. So using these savings became one of the main mechanisms to provide new means of income to Chilean citizens, particularly after the increasing instability of employment sources after the pandemic crisis. Between 2020 and 2021, citizens could withdraw 10% of their pension savings 3 times, so 30%. One of the main arguments of Chilean citizens was to claim their personal ownership of retirement savings. Phrases such as my money, my sweat, my hard working, my effort, and of course my savings, well, were all over the place, portraying an individual formula to face the economic crisis. On the other hand, Chileans have strongly questioned their retirement model since 2016. This questioning has been supported by a massive social movement against the private pension model And since 2016, the goal of this social movement has been to put an end to current individual capitalizations, I would say. This movement acquired broad citizen support, organizing demonstrations with a wide diversity of actors, mixing traditional actors such as trade unions, students, political organizations, also with free citizens and first-timers. Also, the movement reached unprecedented massiveness until that date, only surpassed by later mobilizations, such as the feminist mobilization in 2018 and those of the 2019 social outburst, of course. In fact, the pension claim has been a core claim during the social outburst, mostly because of small pensions after retirement, as I was telling you some sentences ago. And nowadays, the modification of this pension scheme is also one of the main debates in the new Chilean constitution under development. So this shows two scenarios. On the one hand, people disagree with the retirement model, being involved in a massive social movement that wants to bring it down because it brings small individual pensions. And on the other hand, people claim the ownership of their retirement savings in order to pay for themselves with their own money the cost of pandemics. In both scenarios, a strong individual choice is at the core of Chilean citizens. This shows an individual formula for facing a collective uncertainty, such as an economic and social crisis, as the pandemic. This is part of a neoliberal narrative that comes both from the citizens and also from the government, from the state. In fact, allowing people to freely use their own retirement funds to handle COVID-19 effects has actually reinforced neoliberalism as a routine to face the social crisis. Instead of agreeing to a collective public alternative, pandemic crisis has strengthened an individual course of action, sustaining the usual neoliberal weight of the Chilean social model. So this shows a complex problem for challenging neoliberalism, actually. On the one hand, social outbreak has been understood as an exhaustion of the neoliberal model. Chile being the laboratory of the neoliberal experiment in the 80s during Pinochet's dictatorship, continued to perfect it after the return of democracy in the 90s. The country became actually the best student of its class, especially when compared to its neighbors in the Latin American neighborhood. For instance, sustained economic growth, political stability were promising for the country's future, at least in terms of macroeconomic indicators. But the social outbreak showed something completely different, revealing the precariousness of the lives of Chilean citizens. And on the other hand, the public and private answers to facing the negative consequences of the pandemic have been coherent with the neoliberal narrative, as shown before. So as I said, the movement against the private pension system I was talking about earlier has succeeded in setting the pension claim at the core of the public and everyday discussion, showing strong citizen support and organizing massive demonstrations in their mobilization. So that's a win. And additionally, this movement has been claiming for the replacement of the individual capitalization model with solidarity, intergenerational solidarity, that's the concept. So placing solidarity as a principle for facing collective uncertainty has not gained enough support. In other words, the neoliberal narrative is still strong enough to produce individual recipes and outperform collective formulas. So that's a loss. So in conclusion, this highlights some challenges for social movements. In this case, the movement against the private pension model was key for stressing the retirement problem. And at the same time, the neoliberal narrative was still strong enough to emerge after the social outbreak, offering individual solutions from retirement savings. So in my opinion, this has been a key challenge for social movements to dispute the meanings of the pandemic crisis. In this case, these meanings are settled between two approaches. So between a collective approach and usual neoliberal answers. So that's a tension there. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for this really. Oh, let me just see if I can see myself now. Yeah, cool. Thank you, Natalia, for this really interesting presentation, and thank you to Abhishek and Rajesh as well. So we will have, let's say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to talk about these challenges, and I found really interesting the interconnections between the three presenters, and in terms of how precarity, authoritarianism, and now, like Natalia, bringing this challenging neoliberalism. So how the pandemic are of course highlighting these problems with democracy in one hand and with the capitalistic neoliberalistic approach to life. So I think these two core elements of modernity, if you want, or like for Western modernity, the pandemic has challenging, and especially when we think about the role of work for the case of India, the pension system in Chile. So I think we have a lot of elements to start a really interesting conversation about how we're going to address this, and how we can reimagine the role of the state, the role of the private companies, the role of the democracy in general to face these problems. So I will open the floor for anyone if they have any kind of, I don't know, questions to our three presenters. So now is the time. Has anyone any questions? If not, I'm just going to provoke, like, I have a question basically. Oh, okay, Lev. Hi, Lev. The floor is yours, and welcome to the conference. Looking forward to hear you tomorrow. Lev, I think you are mute at the moment. Yeah, Lev, if you can just click to the mic icon in the right, and maybe we can hear you.
Now
Yes,
now we can.
yes,
Now you
yeah,
can
yeah,
hear
yeah.
me.
You are now. Hi, welcome.
Welcome. I'm sorry it didn't work at the beginning. My question is to Miranda, to Natalia. How is related the struggle for the pension with the elections in 2021 and the new government? Did they influence this process, in your opinion? That's it. That is the question.
Thank you, Lev. So, Natalia, yes, sure.
Yeah, thank you, Lev, for your question, and very nice to see you again. And yes, of course, the pension claim has been the core of public discussion since 2016. And what is interesting is that the social movement I was talking about earlier has put the pension claim or the discussion at the core of public discussion. But the interpretation of the claim has been very different in different political scenarios. You know, left wingers try to interpret it in a more solidarity idea, and on the other hand, right wingers are more into reinforcing the system that we already have and saying that it's not actually working well, so we need to make it more, to perfect it, you know. And this claim is also very important for the social outburst in 2019, and for the elections in the country as well. It has been one of the part of the agenda of the current government, to make some corrections or maybe to change this pension model. But also, which is interesting, is that we are now in the midst of approving or rejected a new constitution, and the discussion of pensions and how to deal with pensions individually or collectively, it's part of that discussion. So now it's a very tense environment. So yeah, I'm not quite sure which view is going to be more salient, more important. So yeah, it's part of the discussion.
Thank you, Natalia. And I think, Jeffrey, do you have a question?
Yes, thank you. Well, first, I would like to thank RC48 for bringing us two insightful speakers from India. It's definitely indispensable to put India in a global dialogue on this post-COVID world. And I hope we can hear at least 2 minutes of the summary of the conclusion by Abhishek at some point. He just got down by internet connection. My question go actually to the other two speakers. You both, what is common between Rajesh and Natalia is that you spoke about the limits of, let's say, progressive movements, because Natalia shows that at the end, in spite of the historic mobilization in Chile, well, neoliberalism has still some won a big deal in proposing a solution to the current issue, its solution. And likewise, Rajesh insists on the fact that, yes, on authoritarianism in India, in spite of this historic farmer movement, it was actually very limited in its impact because of the power of the governments. My question is, who are the actors behind that? Rajesh mentioned a bit the corporation, and but can we talk about social movements on one side, the side we like, progressive movements, and then say that the other ones are not movements, or who is supporting this neoliberal solution? Are there some movements or actors, at least, behind it in Chile? And of course, the BJP and all the nationalist movement is so massive in India, and so it's also it's not a counter movement, it's dominant movements, the nationalist movement in India. And so how, but you refer to it as a state power mostly, but it's also a movement that is probably behind that. So this is my question for two speakers.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So if Rajesh and Abhishek would like to provide some reflections or answers.
As far as actors behind this farmers movement are concerned, there are a variety of actors. For example, the left farmers unions are of many kinds in India, particularly of three kinds. One, what we call more moderate kind of left party, Communist Party of India. Their organization was also one of the unions behind this movement. There is another called Marxist Party. Their union was also there, and there are 3-4 other unions, more radical kind of communists in India. They also participated in this movement. So this was about the left side of the movements. Many rightist farmers unions were also there in this support of this movement. So the point precisely is that this movement is historic for the reason that all kinds of unions, of all types of union, Kisan unions, that in India, farmers, they form unions, local unions, regional unions, and these unions come together. So the point is that the variety of political actors were there in the movement. Not only political actors, but in terms of classes. For example, this movement got support of some middle classes, particularly what is known as petty bourgeois, old middle class kind of a thing. So those petty bourgeois classes or petty bourgeois class was there behind the movement as economic support of the movement. So because this movement went for 1.5 year old almost, one year, 4 months to be exact. So this movement needed many economic resources because more than 300,000 people were surrounding Delhi. So how they would be fed, and they would need many things. They faced all kinds of weather, extreme cold, heat waves, and monsoon thunderstorms. So, I mean, the point is that a variety of actors were there. Therefore, I say that farmers united as a class, notwithstanding their political factions, their economic factions, and that is an important phenomenon in this movement. They united as a class. So, therefore, the movement could sustain for a longer period of time and can sustain the onslaught of the authoritarian state. So even now we are hearing that the second phase of the movement can be started within a month or two. Now, because when we went to Punjab, we found that even now people are gathering their resources and each and everything to launch another phase of the movement. So that the point is that actors of variety of actors are there, not one kind of actors is there. And lastly, in fact, if you go to farmers and talk to them, they would argue in a very logical and rational way how corporate capitalism is capturing all aspects of social life, even their way of living, how they are capturing. Even they argue much more rationally and much more articulately than us that how these new liberal policies or statist neoliberal policies, a crony kind of policies, are are capturing the wealth of the nation, the resources of the nation. They argue, and they give a fantastic argument in their vernaculars, languages, in their way of arguments. So that is how a rationality behind the movement is also a very important one actor.
And Avishnek, would you like to provide a final remark?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I sincerely apologize for that glitch on my part. To conclude my presentation, actually, there are three primary conclusions which I like to make. One, um, the position of casual workers in organized manufacturing or in a small shops or a small shop floor is already at the worst. So pandemic has created a rupture momentarily, and again the status quo has been maintained. They were not being paid minimum wages. No social security benefits has been given to them, and no other allowances or the leaves are provided to them. So they are basically they are daily wage workers. And again, post pandemic situation remained the same because but how the interesting turn which has emerged is these workers, the more situation worsen for them, the more defiant these workers become. And this is very interesting that I have observed. Like when I went to the field, my understanding was the worker will do anything to earn a living, to earn a wages. But when I went there, I never thought in my worst imaginations that a worker who can be terminated at any moment in a day uh, dare to slap a factory supervisor. But then he did, and then he says that I will his argument is I can work because there is no vertical mobility in the organizational structure for me, but there is immense horizontal mobility. I can get this similar kind of insecure employment anywhere. So this was his argument. He says that okay, you are not paying me enough, nobody is paying me enough, so I will go from one factory to another, one shop from another. So this immense horizontal mobility is basically uh, go- instilling a sense of defiance in him that okay, I cannot go any worse than this. I'm already at the bottom of bottom of the pyramid. And third, post-pandemic, interesting thing which happened is the nature of a state has changed immensely. Now, earlier, which was a distant state, which is not taking care of its worker, which is favoring the corporations, is favoring the workers not as a class, but workers as a citizens. Now they are providing them free rations. They are providing them some free benefits, so cash incentives if you have lose your jobs, medical incentives in some states. So point is, these kind of uh, which I think in local media they are being termed as freebies, but the workers and the dilapidated, the people at the like at the marginalized sections, these helps prove immensely. And they because they return to their villages, they return to their hometowns, and then assurance that you will get a particular amount of food, particular amount of ration every month, like 5 kilograms per person per family, you will get that. It is a huge benefit for them. So point is, the government has ensured, post-pandemic, government has ensured their sustenance, and this sustenance has fed into their resilience. Because now worker is saying to the factory owners that if you don't pay me enough, I'm not coming to the cities. Point is, you will not pay me there, but government is taking care of me, and I will manage some work here and there. So point is, the opportunity cost in the in the city is more. So unless and until the factory owners are able to meet that cost because of these welfare provisions, I have observed that the casual workers have regained their minimal sense of bargaining, which earlier they didn't.
Perfect. Thank you, Abhishek, for that final remark. So thank you to our three presenters. And now, because we are running, as you know, a little bit of late, and to have like a proper times for lunch, I'm going to pass the torch to Natalia, who is the chair for the next session. So Natalia, your chair duties starts now, and thank you once again to you three for this excellent start for the conference. So Natalia, the floor is yours as a chair.
Thanks.
Thank you, Camilo. I will just quickly check if the presenters are here. So we have Antonio Alejo. I don't see him. Then Gargi, yeah. I see you, Gargi. Okay, Yola. Then Benjamin Abrams, yes, it's here. And lastly, Zainab or Sophie. Shall we wait for maybe 5 minutes or no? There you are, Zainab. Hi. So I think we're all set. So hello everyone again. Welcome to our second session of the conference. This session is titled Rights of Minorities, Rights of the Future. And I will moderate this session. Camilo is going to help me as well to moderate the last part of it. First of all, I would like to remind you to keep your mics on mute so we can clearly hear the presentations. And since we have 4 papers, each presentation will be 12 minutes long tops. So we have some minutes left at the end for questions. So I will be checking the time, so I will quickly alert each speaker when you have 5 and 2 minutes left. So let's begin. So the first presentation, Alejo, Antonio Alejo, are you here? I don't think so.
No, Natalia, I think he's not. No,
he's not.
online.
Okay, let's move to the second paper then. So yeah. So our first presentation is titled Policy and Abolition and Civil Liberties, Social Movement Organizing in England and Wales During COVID by Gargi Bhattacharya. I think I have pronounced it well. Mónica Bernos Llanos and Yola Solanke from the University of East London and the University of Leeds. So Gargi, the floor is yours. We can hear you. We can see you, but we can't hear you. You have to unmute the mic.
Screen share, why is that? And let's try again.
Yeah.
Sorry about this, I'm not sure.
Yeah, don't worry.
So,
Might be 'cause-
Ricardi, can you see an arrow just in the right front?
I can, but it's not giving me the option to share because I'm doing it on a Google Slides. Okay, I'm going to just...
Would you like to send us your presentation and maybe Natalia or I can?
I'm going to put it... Well, I'm so sorry, I'm going to just do that now.
Okay.
I was overconfident and didn't do that, but...
Sorry, Natalia, that I just jump on your sharing duties.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry. Bye.
And the first part I can do without the slides, so I can just send it and then begin.
Yeah.
And then hopefully, I'm putting it in the chat. I hope that's a way that someone can get it. I don't know if... Right. So I'm... Okay, I'm just going to begin and hope that my slides come, and otherwise I can just tell you the story, although it's a shame you can't see my quotes. Thank you for inviting me. I'm speaking on behalf of a team of people from a project called CoPower, which has been a project looking at the experience of racially minoritized people in Britain through the COVID pandemic. And in particular, I've been working with my colleagues Monica and Diola on looking at COVID emergency powers. As in common with many places in the world, the pandemic led to a set of kind of emergency provisions by the state that extended state powers, in particular around issues of policing, but we also looked at the ways in which practices around bereavement had new emergency measures around them about what you could do with bodies and the transportation of bodies. But today I was just going to talk a little bit about some of the things we found almost alongside the work we were doing around social movement organizing during the pandemic, and how the kind of staging of policing amended or shaped how people thought about the role of protest and their relationship to the state. And actually, probably because there's so little time, it's better for me just to speak it, but I'll look on my phone in case that reminds me what order I want to say things in. And I am sorry that it's so difficult to use different formats. I should have thought of that before. So one of the things that we've very much thought from a British context is that the pandemic forwarded the role of policing in ways that really extended people's awareness of, oh, thank you so much. Yes. So that's the first one. I've already said it. Can you go to the next one, please? Thanks. So firstly, again, people may or may not know this, Britain was one of the places that was very reluctant to institute measures around the pandemic. There was already very high rates of infection across Europe before Britain did anything much. And in some ways, the public response preceded the state response. But once there is a state response, that state response in a way that is quite usual in Britain, I think sadly is quite usual in other places, it followed the model of emergency. And what that meant in terms of emergency was that there was very quickly drafted new legislation which extended police powers and some other state powers, and also took away some state responsibilities, especially around local government responsibilities around social care. And it did it very, very quickly. It's a very poorly drafted legislation. It's very, very ambiguous. And that high level of ambiguity has really shaped a lot of what has happened since then in Britain. Can you move to the next slide, please? So as I was saying a little bit earlier, that our view from doing our research was that the pandemic really repositioned policing, so it was much more central in people's consciousness. So not only communities who have a long history of being over-policed, for everyone, there's a different kind of theatrical staging of the role of the police. Most of all, because those emergency measures staged public health as a matter of public order, so that the regulation of public health became a policing matter, and a policing matter that was very much framed as a public order offence. And all of that is happening at the same time as global and national controversies and mobilizations around police violence. So on the one hand, people are being forced to think more about the role of police and having different kinds of encounters, including people who maybe did not have those encounters before. And on the other hand, there's a kind of agitation around police violence as a particular form of state violence and authority, not least from Black Lives Matter, but beyond that as well. Next slide, please. Again, this is probably more useful for people. I think most people in the room are actually probably not doing research in Britain. That Britain, again, in common with many places, had some strange street presences through the pandemic. And there are different kinds of heightened movements around who could take space when, about public display. When I say comportment, that's about like how you conduct yourself. That there are some controversies in this country, even before Partygate, about the ways in which in the first summer of the pandemic, there were some hot days and the beaches were very much filled with white populations, but very little policing. But at the same time, there were certain kinds of leisure activity and block parties that were happening in black neighborhoods that were very heavily policed, sometimes unsuccessfully policed, like some key social media footage of police trying to intervene in a block party and pretty much being run off the estate by the residents together. Two key moments in that longer process is the murder of Sarah Everard by a serving police officer, and the vigil around that. In May 2020, there's an almost spontaneous, not actually spontaneous, but organised in very short notice, vigil around the abduction and murder of Sarah Everard. And it wasn't known at the beginning of the organising, but by the time of the vigil, it was known that a serving police officer had been arrested for that crime. And I'll fill in a little background because I forget that not everyone is Britain-based. That a kind of one organisation who didn't have much reach in the streets said they were calling a vigil and then were told by the police that no, it's unlawful to have such a vigil, and said that they were not calling a vigil. In that moment, other more grassroots focused kind of organisations, including an increasingly high profile group called Sisters Uncut, said, well, it's not for the police to say when we will mourn. And also people already travelling to this space. So in the end, there was a very, very large vigil around the abduction and murder of Sarah Everard that was very, very violently policed, and had many media images of very young women of all ethnicities being very, very violently policed in the aftermath of the abduction and murder of a woman who they've then arrested a serving police officer for. With far less coverage, a week later, there was an anti-lockdown protest. This is one of the few images I could find of it. Far less coverage and very different policing, but again, a kind of a similar skepticism towards the role, authority, and credibility of the state, although it's a different constituency. So I'm going too slowly. Next slide, please. I'm just going to tell you the headlines because there isn't time for me to show you my quotes, but I don't know if we're going to share slides later. Different things we found from speaking to people, that the kinds of mobilizations that are happening globally around Black Lives Matter through the time of the pandemic brought a much more explicit articulation and understanding of what state racism could be across locations. People are looking at the states and they're re-understanding what's happening in Britain. And that very much impacted on how people narrated the state failures around the pandemic, in particular for racially minoritized communities. Certainly in the first periods of the pandemic, it was well known in Britain and even documented by the state that racially minoritized communities were far harder hit, far greater levels of death in the first period, and for a long time still a sense that these are the communities who are suffering more. And I think we've not yet taken a reckoning with that, of how widespread that has been, but certainly very extensive levels of loss and illness in racially minoritized communities that felt more for them than it did for the white community. And that changed how people thought about state racism, where it happens and what you can do against it. Sorry, next slide, please. And one of our interviewees said something which kind of summarized this, that Black communities, we know, are underprotected and over-policed. It's as simple as that. That's what happens, over-policed and underprotected. Now, that had been said for a long time in political movements against state violence. I think what happens, or we were being told was what happens from the different people we worked with, is that idea of being underprotected becomes a much more important way of thinking about state violence, because during a pandemic, state neglect was immediately deadly, and we could see the differential deadliness of that structural neglect, which was the other counterpart to being over-policed. Next slide, please. This is a long quote, but it's really a quote about how the police themselves were quite jumpy and overzealous in this time. And it's a point about saying that during the pandemic, I think it was 2021 by then, the statue of Edward Colson, famous slave trader in Bristol, which had been in the centre of Bristol and been a point of controversy for Bristol for a long time, a crowd of activists decided they were going to stop lobbying the council and instead removed the statue of Colson, rolled it down the road and threw it in the river. This quotation is from a Bristol activist who's talking generally about the pandemic, but says that that changed it because it made the police be very jumpy and it made there be a different kind of in particular, at the end of the quote, they say, that you'd see 20 or 30 police officers surrounding every statue at the same time as there's an increasing understanding of the underprotection of some communities. So an overprotection of statues, but an underprotection of humans. Next slide, please.
2 minutes left.
2 minutes, okay, thanks. So this was really part of a continuation of over-policing. Next slide, please. And was greatly kind of amplified by the ways in which Black Lives Matter leads to a structural analysis of the inequalities of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Overall, lots of our interviewees were saying, because we're interviewing across the pandemic until quite recently, that these activities, including the ways that the Everard Vigil was policed and what's come out about that since then, really led to a much further loss of legitimacy for the police and that holding of public space. Next slide, please. So within that, I think there's something to think about. And of course, our project was not about social movements per se, but because of who we're interviewing, people were reflecting on social movement organizing, about who is the imagined audience for street protests. So in Britain, it seems to us, this spectacle of a willful state failure, Britain has increasingly said, who knows? Who can tell? Who knew? I was ambushed by a cake. I don't know what happened. That willful state failure through the pandemic moves the centre of gravity for protest movements. That we've seen this time in which the pandemic makes the UK government kind of embrace and be theatrical about its incompetence or illegitimacy. That there's a very different kind of model of political theatre happening in Britain now in terms of electoral politics. And the street protests often also articulated this view, both the anti-lockdown and anti-vax protests and the different protests against state violence say that the government is both illegitimate and incompetent. So street protests, in this period, instead of kind of making a claim to government, who have made themselves this kind of ridiculous figure, are reframed as something else. And I think there's something of interest of what happens to social movements when the state says, who knows, we're just so funny. You can't hold us to account because we'll just tell some silly jokes again. That making ridiculous of state authority changes the space of public protest, and the pandemic, because of the many failures, not only by the British state, but by many states, seems to heighten that moment when street protest is for a different audience or for each other. So that was what I had to say. I hope it was within the time in the end.
Thank you very much, Gorgi. Yeah, right on time. Very interesting. So let's move to our second presentation, which is titled Mobilization Without Opportunity, the UK's 2020 Black Lives Protest by Benjamin Abrams from University College London. So Benjamin, the floor is yours. 12 minutes.
I believe I'm allowed to go last, if that's okay. So if we could have the second presenter first, and then I could go, that'd be great.
Okay, so maybe we can sign up. Are you okay with that? I know.
Yes, yeah, I'm okay with it.
Do you hear me? Do you want to continue? Okay, so I will present you. Yeah. So this our second presentation in this case is titled Different Practices of Imagining and Embodying Solidarity for the Colonial Climate Justice in Montreal by Zaina Vergara and Sophie Van Ness from the Institut National de la Recherche Scientifique, Centre Urbanisation Culture Société. So Zaina, the floor is yours.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Natalia. And I'm really happy to be with you today, even though if it's only online. I will need the help of Camilo though, because I think I am not able to share the presentation. So maybe Camilo can assist me. And
yes.
So I'm Zaina, and I am actually a PhD candidate in urban studies. And this presentation is about the research that I am doing with my PhD director, Sophie Van Ness. She's not here with us today, but we have developed the research together, we're working on it together, and even the presentation we did it together. And the study is actually about how social movements reframe climate justice through place and through their anchors into place. So we are trying to understand how the links between social movements and climate justice are made through actually the lived experience of place. So it all started actually by how urban activism has challenged the notion of climate justice. And here, very quickly, actually, climate justice is about actually all related to how social and environmental struggles are extremely linked. And this has been challenging the mainstream environmental movement for climate, which is not only in Montreal, Turkey, in Canada, but pretty much everywhere in the global north, mainly white, middle class, technical experts oriented with a very much universalizing vision. So it doesn't include that much of what grassroots groups in the margin have been criticizing for quite some years, actually. And it has been challenging and transforming how climate justice has been framed through their activism. So instead of, for example, focusing on global relations, local leaders are actually speaking about the unequal urban structure that produces precarity, poverty, racial oppression, and how this increase the climate vulnerability in the city. They show us how climate vulnerability and racism are linked, and that actually the fact that, for example, in some spaces people are suffering way more of climate change is not a coincidence. It is like pretty much linked to other city planning and other political decisions. So more and more activists are speaking of the decolonial or intersectional climate justice, and they're situating actually their discourse and their action in the context and the territories where these intersections happen and where the oppression is contested. Next. And during the pandemic, we have observed that actually it was a particular context pretty much everywhere for social ecologicist struggles everywhere, and in Montreal it's no exception. So what we know about the links between pandemic and these social movements is that actually the social movements have never stopped. With lockdown or not, and as we have seen in other presentations today, they were very much active. They just sometimes had to change the way that their actions are conducted. They had also to do some other things that they were not initially doing. And for example, in Montreal, the pandemic gave more time to some activists, for example, to develop some more anchored and linked to the places of the everyday life relationships. It gave actually more time, for example, in one of the cases of the study that I won't have time to present today, but it gave more time actually for the people to develop the strategy within and on the sites that they are fighting for. It also changed the way that some activists are conducting their activities, especially in one case that also I will be speaking briefly about. It's totally changed. For example, the one who were doing transnational activism has actually less opportunities to do direct action, but they took more time to develop their popular education activities, for example. They did more virtual webinars, etc. And in terms of organizing, well, obviously, like virtual meetings had taken like a huge place amongst the panel of organizers, but also it developed actually different networks and so on. So in our research, we have tried actually to look at 3 cases, and the research question was trying to understand how the experience of oppression in specific places during the pandemic used to redefine the struggle of climate justice, and how actually the expected practices of convergences between the social and the ecological struggles happened. And we have some examples in the next slides for what kind of activities that we are talking about. So maybe if we can move on to Milo, it would be cool. We have just like some images. The next one. The next one is about actually how activists, the 3 examples of some of the main activities that were done, which is actually a series of webinars and trainings, especially on the colonial climate justice and indigenous struggles and racism. And on the next slide, please. And yeah, so this is like what we see, for example, on the left, and it was actually a series of virtual and virtual meetings where activists from different backgrounds and not necessarily climate justice and even less climate justice, they have conducted like a series of webinars where they talked about, for example, housing struggle, policy, profiling, abolitionist struggle, indigenous struggle, and they linked it actually to climate justice. And it is the main case that I will be talking about today. The other thing is how actually the activists were recognizing the unequal cost of activism in climate justice, because of course it's not the impact and the risks that activists take while doing their interaction is obviously not the same, depending on their positionality and their situation. And the last example was that actually the groups were working together like on a collective manifesto for a post-pandemic recovery. So it was kind of like an answer to what was done as both like the municipal, provincial, or even maybe the federal level, in order to voice their concern about what was going on. So in the next slide, very briefly, the theoretical framing that we are using, trying to understand how this intersection of social and environmental ecological struggles are happening through the experience of the groups within the place that they are taking their action in, is by using actually how place and social movements have been studied and developed. So here we try to understand how the place is part of the framing processes of the group, and how place is also part of the experience of the world in a very specific case, depending on the trajectory of the person, depending on the situation of the person, and on the structures of oppressions that exist in a very specific context. And lastly, also place as a site of culture and practice of different worldviews, because in this specific intersection of climate and social activism, it's of course linking very sometimes very different worldview, very different ways of looking at the struggle, and also visions actually of the world and of the future. And here, obviously, of course, the indigenous literature and thinking plays a huge role that I won't have a lot of time to talk about. So, but it is very much, it's taking a lot of place in the way that we are trying to understand the three cases. So the three cases that I am talking about, and it's on the next slide, are one is called the Hub, and it's actually a sort of an organization trying to work on climate and social justice. It's very urban. But nevertheless, it's working with activists from pretty much different various backgrounds. They have a very specific focus on BIPOC perspectives on climate struggle, and it highlights actually the experience of inequalities in the city for racialized and marginalized people, and these are actually the case. This is the case that I will be talking about today, and these are the ones that I showed examples before, whom helped actually an initiative called No Climate Justice Without Social Justice, who have organized these webinars, trying actually to bring activists from different backgrounds and link them and understand how they can actually work together. The second case the second and the third that we are working on, but I won't have time to present today, is one is called Mobilisation 6600, and it's actually it's a movement that is very, so the Hub is pan-Canadian, if you want to. So it's the scale is actually quite large, but they have started in Montreal, and during our observation they were very much focusing on Montreal. The second one is very local, so it's a group that is working on fighting against let's say the dispossession, even though legally like it's more complicated than that, but it's sort of a dispossession from land that the group and the people, the inhabitants, use actually for several activities. And the last one is more a transnational solidarity group, and they have a very strong feminist, decolonial, and anti-extractivist perspective. So these three work on this intersection of social and ecological struggles in different ways, and I will be focusing on the Hub. So we have done a lot of observations online and in situ. We've done documentary analysis and focus groups. And so the main the main first results are actually in the next slide. We can see a quote from one of the activists actually talking about how this intersection can happen and how they can actually work on both by centering the margin. So this is something that comes again and again and again, especially in this case. It's how to center the margin. So what you were saying is that actually what they are trying to do is...
2 minutes left.
Okay, I'll be quick. So what they're trying to do actually is, instead of changing the concepts and reframing climate justice by bringing social, so what they're trying to do is changing the conception of what climate justice is and bring social justice into it, instead of going into different ways, which is actually what's quite happening today. So in the next one, we can see that actually how place plays a role in that is that actually place is both seen as the space of oppression, but also the space where solidarities are built between those different groups and creating something as even a new thing. So how they explain it is that actually it's place as a space of oppression between social and climate. For example, how housing and extreme heat happen. As I said, like it's linked to many different things, linked to housing with the city organization itself, and how the gentrification, for example, comes also with an increase of green spaces and park spaces, especially like in the case like in green gentrification, and it comes with an increase of policing and racial profiling for the people who were actually living in the neighborhood before, and the unequal also access to green spaces in the city is not obviously like the same for everyone. So there is an unequal experience and unequal response also from the municipality, from the administration at all its level to the struggle. And in the next one, we can see also another both example. It's an example and a way actually of how this intersection and convergence between those two struggles happen specifically during the pandemic. Actually, all the examples are during the pandemic. But for example, here there was like a link between migrant justice and climate change, because there were this whole discourse about essential workers, but at the same time, deportations were happening at the same time. The activists were also trying to make more visible the global and the local link between climate change and actually the social inequalities, specifically for migrant justice. So this reframing of the struggle, as we can see in the next slide, has actually went beyond those groups in the margins that we were observing. So we say groups in the margins because, like, as in contrast with the mainstream groups, because they are like actually bringing this kind of issues in the front, but it has gone even even beyond the margins themselves. And the students' movements, who generally like organize every year the climate protests, have also last year actually put in the front the issue of climate justice itself, and part of these discourses were also in this, because like that, so we can understand that there is a circulation of ideas, and these ideas are actually going well beyond the margins and really so going beyond the margins. The conclusions, the first conclusions, is that actually the mainstream environmental movement has this kind of blind spots, which is racial justice, and the links between the lived urban everyday life in capitalist city and the climate struggle. So these are actually two of the main points that groups from the margin, organized by poor people, bring to the table. And these are like urgent issues, and the pandemic has even increased this kind of injustices. And the fact that it is missing from the analysis of the mainstream movements is also, of course, missing from the solutions that the technical solutions that they are proposing. So this is like a different way of imagining how we can organize and develop. Other blind spots pointed by groups on the margin is the urban-local links between urban, social, and climate issue, as I talked about, and the links between migrants and climate justice, and also a very important part of the research and of what the groups are doing is, and one of the main points in the discourse is the historical link between colonization and the current situation happening. So, so this actually puts the mainstream environmental movement in one of the biggest critiques, which is that it is a historical movement. So this way of understanding the current situation, of course, brings another way of framing the movement, and also another way of putting the intersection between social and climate justice movements on the forms, and developing different kind of solution, different kind of action, developing both like, on the level of the city and beyond. And using place to understand that allow us actually to put this more in the front. Thank you very much for your listening, and I will be happy to talk further about that during the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Sarah, for your excellent presentation. And let's move to our last presentation from Benjamin Abrams from University College London. The presentation is titled the Mobilization Without Opportunity, the UK's 2020 Black Lives Protests. So, Benjamin, the floor is yours. You have 12 minutes as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'll try and be as quick as I can, in view of the fact that we're running a bit behind the general. So yeah, basically this paper, I don't have a PowerPoint presentation or anything like that. So I'm just going to kind of give it to you, more or less from my handwritten notes. But if there are any questions or clarifications, I'm happy to address those after. So the summer of 2020 saw hundreds of thousands of Britons join Black Lives Matter mobilizations. Sparked by protests in the United States, the UK's 2020 Black Lives demonstrations constituted the country's first major protest of the COVID-19 pandemic, with the possible exception of course, the Sarah Everard vigil earlier mentioned, that even though it wasn't well attended, became arguably a major protest, if only because of its reception following the police repression that took place. But after a spate of solidarity actions targeted principally against the US government in late May, an anglicized expression of the American movement's demands gathered pace over here in the month of June. And this created the basis for a rejuvenated protest movement that remained active long after. However, there is a really peculiar characteristic that these 2020 protests exhibited. The absence, in the UK at least, of a discernible political opportunity on which the movement might have been able to capitalize. It's really odd when you think about it, right? Actually, that it wasn't a great time to stage a Black Lives Matter movement in the UK if you take into account all of these political opportunity features, and we'll walk through them over the course of the paper. And so I became interested in this case of mobilization without opportunity because it helps us think about whether political opportunity is indeed, as political opportunity theorists like Tilley and Darrow and McAdam have claimed, is indeed a necessary condition for mobilization. And moreover, what configuration of factors might be sufficient for mobilization in the absence of opportunity. And so that's what I set out to do in this article. I used what are now called open source methods. Open source methods doesn't actually mean that you open source all of your data that you gather, although that can be the case if you so wish. But rather it means that you rely primarily on information that is available to anyone, potentially, so non-privileged information, such as broadcast media, public online discussions, video footage, open repositories, proceedings of public meetings, government data, and commercial or organizational reports. And the advantage of this wide range of data sources is that you can make informed causal inferences without necessarily having to collect sensitive personal data or procure rare archival documents. And in cases where there are conflicts between protesters and police, often you place your respondents in quite a precarious position when you ask them about what happened at a protest. And so open source methods can be preferable here. And that's why I chose to do it for this particular study. And so first, I'll give you a very, very quick rundown of what went down over the course of the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. At the end of May, a small spate of protests occur across the UK, mostly in London. Some of these were at the US Embassy. Not very much happens. A small smattering of left-wing groups attend these protests, but people take notice. At this time, there are lots of slogans that say things like "Justice for George Floyd," "Your pain is our pain," and Floyd's kind of dying slogan, "I can't breathe." And so these are protests that are primarily solidarity protests with the United States. By the end of May, however, major organized groups such as Stand Up to Racism, Unite Against Fascism, Black Lives Matter UK begin throwing their weight behind further mobilizing efforts. These groups hadn't really been engaged in large-scale protests for quite some time, partly owing to the pandemic, partly owing to the kind of waning of Black Lives Matter in the UK news cycle. The last major explicitly Black Lives-oriented protests in the UK took place as far back as 2016, when we look at ones with major organizational support. And so you see this kind of gradual ramping up of protests, which eventually peaks in early June with this massive protest outside Parliament Square. However, shortly before this, on June 3rd, there is another substantial protest at which the actor John Boyega, also known for Star Wars, comes and gives this kind of incredible speech. And you start seeing more British Black people's names being chanted in the crowd. So people start talking about Mark Duggan and Stephen Lawrence, both victims of police and racist violence. And then you have this enormous protest outside Parliament on the 6th of June. And at this point, the movement has more or less turned to a UK focus. And so there are signs that are held saying things like "Racist UK, birthed racist America. The UK is not innocent. Fuck the government. Fuck Boris Johnson." People start defacing government buildings with Black Lives Matter slogans. Then in other parts of the UK, you see other actions. So, for example, in Glasgow, activists tear down street signs and rename the streets after the victims of police violence, black radicals. In Bristol, you see a toppling of a Edward Colston statue in which it's thrown into the river. And then continuing this process, you then see kind of plentiful protests over the course of June and July and rolling through almost into 2021 of smaller scale actions. And you see the birth of this kind of rejuvenated British Black Lives movement. However, we look at what actually happens subsequently. The UK government begins collaborating with the National Police Chiefs Council to put in place a raft of new powers to more effectively repress Black Lives Matter protests. And in fact, explicitly noted that the status quo was too readily in favor of protests, cited the Black Lives Matter protests. And on the broader question of structural institutional racism, the government commissions a report that claims institutional racism doesn't exist in the UK, calls for more attention to the struggles of white British groups. And so a year later, at a kind of conference on the progress of Black Lives Matter, a number of prominent Black studies professors get together and they say that the movement is now in a worse position than we were prior to the eruption and the protests in the first place. We're now in a position, and this is a direct quote, we're now in a position where we're having to again justify whether racism exists. We've gone backwards. And so this is an example of profoundly inopportune mobilization. And these political opportunities are generally defined as existing an open political system in which power relations between elites are unstable. There are elites who are also sympathetic to the movement, and the state is incapable of carrying out effective repression. These are the kind of 4 conditions that Dr. McAdam cites. None of these are present in the UK. Instead, we see a closed-off political system. Existing power relations remain stable, elites are unsympathetic, and the state is willing and able to shut down contentious political activity. There's a patently inopportune case of mobilization. And so then we have this question of, okay, so why does mobilization take place? What do we actually see powering mobilization in the absence of opportunity? And my analysis brought up 3 major factors. The first of these is what could be called quotidian disruption. This is a term that David Snow and colleagues often use to refer to this phenomenon. It basically means a disruption to the kind of everyday routines and patterns that characterize our lives. This can often amplify people's biographical availability, their kind of capacity to partake in protest because of factors in their lives that are either conducive to it or constraints that are absent. And the example here is, of course, what we see in the UK COVID pandemic, but also more importantly, the COVID lockdown. in which people are suddenly much more available to, for example, go to a protest one afternoon during the week or at the weekend, because A, they do not have social plans because those are prohibited at the time, and B, they are usually constrained to their own household rather than at their place of work, and so are more able to attend protests in their locality. You see, for example, a large number of protests in London's Finsbury Park during this time, which is not known as a gathering point for protests usually, but because it's near a very large residential district, saw more protests. And there is some interesting government data kind of backing this, looking at the effect of furlough in the youngest age category. So, for example, 2/3 of young people, the major category that partook in Black Lives Matter protests, were furloughed during this time or out of work, meaning that they're, of course, again, available to partake. So one of these elements is what we could call quotidian disruption. But this still doesn't help us understand why people participated. Because being available to protest doesn't mean that people will. And this is where frame diffusion comes in, this second factor. And what frame diffusion does for us is it allows the American case, this very urgent and very opportune context for mobilization for Black lives, to kind of infiltrate the British psyche. People start by thinking that they're going to support the American Black Lives Matter movement, and before they know it, they are engaged in sustained protests. And so what happens is you have this gradual domestication of what are initially protests in support of the American Black Lives movement to become protests that then support the British one. And so in this context, the opportunity calculus for protesters, what's sometimes called the attribution of opportunity, is short-circuited because people have attributed an opportunity in the United States, and then they engage in the process of mobilization for British Black Lives Matter causes, which are slightly different in terms of what they demand and what they're looking for and other things. But the third factor, and I think the most interesting one in terms of breaking ground in terms of social movement studies, something that I think goes beyond what we already know about, is the effect of what I call remaindered resources. And what we see here is we see movement organizations that have stocked up huge amounts of resources that have been unable to disperse them, partly because of the COVID pandemic, partly because of the lack of any Black Lives Matter themed mobilizations in the past. Because the thing is that movement resources are seldom non-perishable, exchangeable goods like fuel, precious metals, or things like that. Rather, among the 5 separate categories of resources that resource mobilization theorists tend to use, material, human, social, organizational, cultural, and moral, many actually offer diminishing utility the longer they remain idle. Human resources, for example, such as activist commitment, are even muscular in character. They're strengthened by judicious use, but they atrophy when idle. Others can often be outmoded, right? They can physically or informationally decay over time or become detached from the movement because of changes in network structure. All this means that players in social movement arenas often have to make use of their resources in order to retain their capacity for mobilization and in order to retain resource flows, keep them ongoing. And so in this situation where it had almost been half a year without employing any movement resources in any serious mobilizing capacity by the time these George Floyd protests kick off in the US, there's little reason to believe that they're going to be mobilizing in the future because of the COVID-19 pandemic and the lockdown restrictions. There is this situation in which there is a sudden urgency to disperse resources, made all the more important by a new surge of human, cultural, and moral resources coming from public supporters, sympathetic journalists, new members of the movement network that are getting involved, millions and millions of pounds in fundraising. So, for example, one group, UK BLM, attracts more than £1.2 million in fundraising, has absolutely no way to disperse it and is desperately trying to get rid of the money during this period. They actually end up doing some really fantastic work, but it was really, really difficult for them to eventually get there. And so what we see is this overwhelming volume of resources that flows into the UK Black Lives Movement during the summer of 2020. And many of these are in effect remaindered between 2020 and 2022. This is to say that kind of almost like a bookseller's remaindered stock, they get dispersed in the context where, despite this suboptimal opportunity structure, retaining these resources would have been impractical or impossible. The resource mobilization, used to then mobilize further protests and make public claims, serves as a means of cutting or averting resource losses that would otherwise have been incurred. And these remaindered resources then help facilitate short and longer term mobilizations by grassroots Black Lives Matter groups and organizations right up until the present. And so this is this kind of interesting scenario that we're met with in the UK Black Lives Matter case, where despite the fact that actually the deck is really stacked against them from a political opportunity perspective, from a sociological perspective, from a framing perspective, and from a resource perspective, the conditions are actually quite ripe to engage in mobilization. You have enormous sociological disruption, this quotidian disruption I talk about. You have very conducive frames from the United States to help generate initially supportive protests that can then be domesticated. And then you have this enormous bulk of undispersed resources and influx of new resources that need to be dispersed for the movement to be able to continue going. And amid these three characteristics, you end up with inopportune mobilizations. Now, of course, the problem here is that these were indeed inopportune, right? The movement doesn't succeed in its goals. And so I think the subsequent question for us really is, could there have been a method of inopportune mobilization that also, that's okay. Could there have been a method of inopportune mobilization that also pivots the structure of opportunity more generally? And Donatella Della Porta, who spoke earlier at this conference, and colleagues have talked about the staging of eventful protests as one way in which movements can do this, right? They can actually, rather than targeting authorities or those who are able to act on movement claims, they seek to transform the opportunity structure to then create more conducive settings for mobilization. Sewell also has some interesting discussion of this, talking about the kinds of events that transform opportunity structures by constituting and empowering new groups of actors, or by re-empowering existing groups in a new way. And so I'm going to kind of leave you with this question, which is, we've seen that you can have mobilization without opportunity, but could you potentially have victory without opportunity if you use these mobilizations to also stage eventful protests and transform the opportunity structure? And that's all for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Benjamin. It was a really rich presentation. So now we have some minutes left for questions from the audience. So I invite you to ask directly, unmuting your mic, maybe turning on your camera if you have a question for one of our three presentation speakers. So any comment, any question? Yep. We have a question from Breno. Yeah, great. So Breno, please go on.
Yeah, hello, Natalia. Hello, everyone. Thanks. Very interesting presentations. I have a question for Zainab. I really enjoy your presentation, and what I liked most was your discussion on the tensions between mainstream ecological movements and more critical perspectives, which emphasize this intersectionality and a more place-based perspective that's always quite sensitive to inequalities, right? But I would like to ask you that beyond the Montreal case, many of the more critical socio-environmental movements are also seeking to influence other conventional movements, such as peasant labor movement, to adhere to this environmental agenda. And I think a key argument for this is the impossibility of separating the environmental from the social issue. You are right. And I would like to ask you about that. How is this happening in the case of Montreal or Canada more broadly? Thanks.
Yes, sure. Natalia, can I go ahead, or do you want to?
Yeah, go for it, please.
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. Yeah, that's actually one of the key points that we are trying to enhance and to shed the light on, because the way actually the whole climate justice itself is framed by the activists here is putting this link. And so one of the first things that they didn't have time to develop in the conclusion is first to go back actually to the root itself. So in order to go out of the technical solution and of how like seeing nature as a resource, it's actually the whole way of seeing nature separated than the city, and those kind of like looking at the world actually in silos, that is being challenged. And here the indigenous movements and the indigenous thinking plays a huge role here, especially the groups that are fighting actually for the decolonization of the land, obviously, but also of our ways of thinking. So they put it in its historical context. So the way of seeing it is that it's not because now we have, I don't know, a certain mode of industrial developments that we are now facing climate change. It's actually all our interaction with nature that has been colonized, changed, that is putting us actually in the crisis that we are here. So there is this first thing, it's like the historical explanation of the crisis and linking colonization with the situation we are in now. The second one is the anti-racist movement, and also, well, actually in the anti-racist movements, there is a lot of points that they bring. And one of the webinars that they have done and that I have talked about briefly in the presentation is one, for example, that was super interesting. It was bringing activists from Defund the Police and activists from the abolitionist movement, who generally don't talk about climate change at all. And the activists were saying we have never felt like interested by the climate change discussion because they don't talk about that, they don't talk about our issues. And during the webinar, actually, when people were talking about inequalities in the city, housing, gentrification, racial profiling happening in the parks, for example, because like one of the solutions is having more green spaces. But while green spaces are not synonym actually of happy time, it's more synonym actually of having more tickets for racialized people. So it's not the same. We don't see it as the same, and it brings actually this to the discussion. And at the end, the conclusion is that actually climate change is having an impact and a huge effect on the life of racialized, of BIPOC people in general. So they are part of the discussion, but the way it is framed doesn't put these issues on the table. So I will maybe like just stop here, but these are like two of the points that they are trying to reframe the whole discussion by putting the lived experience on the front and by situating the discussion in its historical and local context.
Thank you very much. I think we have another question for Gargi. Let's try to keep it short because we're kind of right on time. Yes, Gargi.
Yeah, Gargi. So I was just going to make another comment from what Zainab is saying, and also reflect a bit on Benjamin's paper, that actually my activist life in Britain really leads me to think that there are more and more connections being made between certainly younger climate activists, people organising against state violence, people organising against borders. I was just in an event yesterday, I've forgotten the name of it, I think it's a book called Against Borders that two close friends of mine, Luke de Nerona and Gracie Bradley, have just written, which is about border abolitionism, but which says that actually border abolitionism is part of climate justice and that you cannot disentangle these things. If you look at the national mobilizations around Black Lives Matter in this country, many of the small protests were happening led by very young people in non-metropolitan places, in very small places. And I think it's impossible to understand that without thinking about the school climate strikes and the ways in which younger layers of activists are coming to activism very differently. So I think something is happening, even if the so-called spokespeople movements in any of these areas don't articulate their politics in that way, in terms of actual political practice. And I can see this with people I know across Europe and actually beyond, that these matters around state violence, survival, cost of living, actually from the previous session, and climate justice, increasingly because of how we're living, become not easily extricable. And I think that's interesting for all of us who are interested in like what mobilization means. So it's not a question, I just thought I'd say it.
Great,
Natalia, there is another question from Francesca Bianchi in the chat.
Can you
Francesca,
read it? Because I don't have it.
Would you like to pose it directly?
Yeah, thank you so much.
Hi.
Very much your presentation. And I'm wondering if your research were carried out only in London or in other towns or cities. I find very interesting the elements of care, the care for statue, but not a monument, and not the care for humans. So this is very, very important, I think, question of your paper. So it was a methodological question. Thank you.
Yes, no, sorry, and because I lost my slides, I didn't remember to tell people that our project, it has 8 partners, and there are other elements that are looking at issues like care and young people and fitness and diet and housing. And our project, it runs across England and Wales, so not only London, but also in Newport and Cardiff in Wales, and in Bristol and Southampton, and in Coventry, and I think some work in Leicester as well. But it's kind of, and we did a little bit of work of some interviewing work of people in other places beyond these places, because we're interviewing online as well. So a lot of this it doesn't reflect on Scotland, but it does reflect different kinds of organisational practice across England and Wales.
Yeah, it was very, very interesting. Thank you.
Great, amazing. So do you have more questions from the audience? Yeah, you were saying something or not? No.
No,
Okay.
just to I think we have to close because we have 50 minutes late, and then we have to start with the other session.
Yeah, we're on time.
So we need to have around 1 hour for lunch. A little bit less, probably. Camilo,
yeah, Elena, I'm going just to jump here and say, like, we can reconvene at 1:30, so in 45 minutes, so we can have
yeah, sure,
lunch.
Okay.
And yes, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
So thank you
very
to the
thanks
presenters,
to the
Natalia,
presenter and to the participant.
Yeah, thank you very much for all these wonderful presentations.
Thanks, everyone.
See you all in a couple of minutes after lunch.
See you at 1:30.
See you 2:30. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.